There's one country, that has sort of resisted the U.S. on different levels, and it doesn't have the same migration crisis. It's Nicaragua. I actually have a clip from a 1990 broadcast by ABC where they reference an ABC News poll that backs this up in 1990 and shows that most people in the country were actually very happy with the Sandinista government, and Daniel Ortega, then president, had high approval ratings. So you can play that clip.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with some facts and figures from Nicaragua that are going to surprise many Americans. This Sunday, when the people of Nicaragua vote in their first free election in a decade, they will most likely elect as president the man Washington loves to hate. More than half of all Nicaraguans like the way Ortega has been running the country. A majority trust the Sandinistas to run a fair election. Most say the Sandinistas have done an excellent or a good job in dealing with Nicaragua's problems. Despite all the emphasis in the U.S. on the war between the Contras and the government, 3 out of every 4 Nicaraguans say the economy is their biggest concern. Only 13% mention the Contras as the biggest problem. The poll says a lot about how Nicaraguans think of the U.S. More than half think the opposition takes its orders from Washington. 72% are angry the U.S. has supported the Contras. And while a majority of people in Latin America usually say they would like to move to the U.S. for better economic opportunities, 7 out of 10 Nicaraguans say they would never come here. A couple of other notes about our Nicaraguan poll. We designed the questions. The poll was conducted by the Washington posters Belden and Rusinello, who have a lot of experience in Latin America. It wasn't a phone poll. All the respondents wrote down their own answers in secret and apparently with great enthusiasm. And here is one more finding. 87% of the Nicaraguans we talked to said they were very concerned that the U.S. might invade their country.
Recent polling actually showed that Ortega, after coming back as president, making a lot of concessions, including to industry groups, to big business in Nicaragua, making concessions to the church. He's far from this firebrand leftist pure socialist, but he's president and he's got an independent foreign policy. He's working with Russia and China on various initiatives. The U.S. isn't totally happy with him, and he was very closely aligned with Venezuela, as well as Cuba, and the whole ALBA economy that had flourished when Hugo Chavez came in Venezuela. The U.S. started pumping money back into Nicaragua, where it had removed Ortega in 1990. And the reason that Ortega lost the election in 1990 was because people just wanted the Civil War to end, and they wanted the U.S. to stop screwing with them. So they were willing to elect this, ultra-conservative neoliberal government of, Violeta Chamorro, who's from one of the oligarchic families. So Ortega is now facing violent protests. There are roadblocks around the country choking the economy. A lot of people have died, mostly on the opposition side, but we have to understand that the opposition has been funded with millions of dollars in training and support for their NGOs and their various groups by the U.S. through the National Endowment for Democracy. Over $4 million last year alone from the NED. USAID has pumped like over $5 million in. And they're actively trying to destabilize another country. And this is a country that is not contributing to the migration crisis, partly because a lot of people go to work just north in Costa Rica, but also partly because people are able to stay in their homes. And while they're very poor, there's healthcare, there's public healthcare, there's public education, there are public health clinics. I've spent time in Nicaragua. I didn't experience the same desire of people to go up to the U.S. that I did when I was in Mexico. So here we are again, trying to destabilize another country and contribute further to the crisis. It's time for people to look at the consequences, or to look at the context of the policies that the U.S. enacts in Central America before they start trying to debate what to do with the people who are already here. It's time to be proactive.
Yeah, we'll actually do an episode devoted specifically to what's going on in Nicaragua sometime soon, so we don't want to go into it in too much detail here, but Max wrote a really good article in the Gray Zone Project. It's at grayzoneproject.com. And his article is called U.S. Government Meddling Machine Boasts of Laying the Groundwork for Insurrection in Nicaragua. That article has kind of gone viral. It's been reprinted a lot of places. And what's interesting
including
is
in
that,
Nicaragua and South America as well.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, like Max said, he lived in Nicaragua for half a year, and we'll talk about it in the future in more detail. But really quickly, I just wanted to address one of the points we've heard in response to this piece, and in response to the interview Max did with me at The Real News. There are some people on the left, it reminds me a lot of what happened in Syria in 2011. And this is not to deny, again, that there were legitimate grievances in Syria. There certainly were. But the idea is, again, that these are progressive protests, and that also not even just that they can somehow lead to progressive change, as if they're not going to just destabilize the country and allow a right-wing U.S.-backed government to come in. And one of the pieces that was written that didn't mention Max, but was clearly kind of based on this talking point and on this, the truth that the U.S. has played a key role, and the NED, the regime change arm, has played a key role in supporting these right-wing groups in Nicaragua. This was an article published by Rebecca Gordon at Tom Dispatch, which was reprinted in Truth Out. And Rebecca Gordon's, she's done really good work on torture specifically. In fact, she has a really good book, maybe we should interview her, called American Nuremberg. And it's very clever. It's the officials who should stand trial for post-9/11 war crimes, in which she lays out, using international law, the American government officials who should be tried at the Hague, at the International Court of Justice or International Criminal Court. But anyway, she wrote this article that was reprinted by Truth Out, and she's pushing back against the leftists and just the journalists who are objective, who are pointing out the role the U.S. has played in destabilizing Nicaragua. And she's using a talking point that was used in Syria that we've heard.
Agency.
Rebecca Gordon wrote, "To blame everything that happens in the country on puppet masters in Washington denies Nicaraguans their own agency." And first of all, no one's doing that. Of course, the whole framing is just obscene. Puppet masters in Washington, they're trying to delegitimize the whole notion of U.S. intervention. But what's amazing about this article is you read the article, and it's a history of how the U.S. has destabilized Nicaragua. And then she has like 3 paragraphs saying, but today is different.
Yeah, well, it's because a lot of people who loved the Sandinistas in the 80s, they're of a different generation. They have an idealized view of them, and the Sandinistas aren't what they used to be because they don't have Soviet support anymore. And so they can't afford to do a lot of what they did. And Nicaragua has no natural resources. So, of course, any Sandinista government is going to make massive compromises. I don't know what these people want, but nothing's ever good enough for them. And they take such a condescending view to the left in Latin America these days. But that agency talking point, I definitely heard that when I wrote about the White Helmets in Syria, which is not even actually a Syrian-run group.
No, and this is what
about the agency? And I'm like, well, what about the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Agency for International Development? Because if it wasn't for those agencies, this unrest in Nicaragua wouldn't be happening. The catastrophe of Syria, where a rebellion was militarized and armed, wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened. There's no debate. All right, that should be beyond debate. It was the CIA that armed them. What about those agencies?
Just this talking point is really dishonest. And what's wild is, again, none of us is denying that there are legitimate grievances. And like Max said, ORTEGA has, because of the politics of the situation, has had to have made massive concessions. Also, from the beginning, the Nicaraguan revolution, the Sandinista revolution, was not like the Cuban revolution, where the Cubans, they expropriated the wealth of the slave-owning capitalist class in Cuba, and most of the capitalists fled to Florida. They had a revolution in which they actually expropriated the wealth of the capitalist class. The Sandinistas were different. They had a more kind of social democratic revolution against a US-backed dictator, Somoza. And in 1979, and after, when they formed what was called the Junta of National Reconstruction, if you look at what they did, the Sandinistas always had a very pragmatic element, and the junta included elements of the business class who were kind of centrist, who were anti-Somoza, but they were not socialists. They were not revolutionaries. And always from the beginning, the Sandinistas had this kind of national democratic developmental mindset that we're going to help develop our country. We're a very tiny country with few resources, with a small economy. We're never going to be able to develop into this like independent socialist stalwart power. I don't know how people expect us to do that. So we're going to work with elements of the national bourgeoisie, elements of the, democratic oriented liberal capitalist class. And that's always what they've done. And they've always made massive concessions. And what's amazing to me is that Rebecca Gordon in this article, she acknowledges the fact that for decades, the U.S. was trying to destabilize Nicaragua. The U.S. funded fascist death squads, the Contras. And then she says, Nicaraguans were not stupid. They knew that as long as the Sandinistas ran the government, the U.S. would continue its Contra war. So in 1990, Nicaraguans replaced the FSLN, that's the Sandinistas, with the UNO party run by Violeta Chamorro, in a result that shocked many people outside Nicaragua, including the Sandinistas' U.S. polling firm. The people had spoken and the Sandinistas accepted their verdict. She points out, that was momentous in itself. For the first time in history, a victorious revolutionary party allowed itself to be voted out of office, relinquishing many of its hopes, but preserving the democratic structures so many Nicaraguans had died to create and maintain. What's interesting about this 2-paragraph passage here is it's in the middle of an article where she's saying that we need to ignore the U.S. role in destabilizing Nicaragua today because we're violating Nicaraguans' agency. But then she says openly, Nicaraguans knew that as long as the Sandinistas ran the government, the U.S. would continue its Contra war. So these people want the best of both worlds. They want Ortega to maintain some kind of fictitious socialist pure paradise where he's just going to he's going to take all the rich people's wealth and expropriate the Chamorro family, and then the U.S. is literally going to just invade. Like, what do they expect to happen? Like in Cuba, where the U.S. tried to assassinate Fidel 638 times and did launch an invasion, a failed invasion.
Yeah, you look at what it's doing to Venezuela's economy right now. I mean, it's as good as an invasion. And they haven't expropriated much. I mean, there are like country clubs that are pretty active in Venezuela.
And this is precisely why they haven't, because they were elected in. These people expect socialists to be elected in and then just to expropriate the rich. Like, no, these leaders are working within like bourgeois capitalist democratic frameworks. And Ortega, regardless of what you think about him, he was reelected in 2016. And he had 2/3 of the vote, and it was widely understood to be a fair and free election. The opposition largely conceded that. The opposition didn't have anything close to resembling the support he had. And again, this isn't, no one, even his supporters and the Sandinistas today in Nicaragua, they recognize the massive concessions that have been made. But what's outlandish is what Max just said, is that Nicaragua is one of the only remaining stable countries in the region that actually isn't contributing to the immigrants, the flow of immigrants and refugees coming to the U.S. But now the U.S. and both Republicans and Democrats and even self-declared socialists are begging for the country to be further destabilized. It's already been destabilized by violence, and further fuel this immigrant and refugee crisis, similar to what we saw in Syria, that Trump and the far right will continue to exploit to gain more and more political power. Like, what do people expect to happen? We saw this again and again and again. We've seen it in the past several years with Libya and Syria and Europe, and it's only fueled the far right. It's fueled the AfD, which is a fascistic party in Germany, and it's fueled other far-right groups in France and the Netherlands, and it's going to do the same thing here, and Trump understands that.
Yeah, so excuse me if I talk about our agencies, but that's, they've played a pretty critical role in the entire crisis we're talking about across the West, and the rise of the right is blowback.